a wonderful crowd we have in this room, and we also have a crowd online in the webinar. So welcome to all of you in all the places that you exist right now. My name is Allison Landsberg, and I am a professor in the Department of History and Art History, and also the Cultural Studies PhD program. And I'm also the director of the Center for Humanities Research. And if this is your first Center for Humanities Research event, please welcome. We're happy to have you here. Please visit our website if you'd like to be on our newsletter. Please let us know. We have a lot of exciting events and opportunities all year long. I want to especially welcome you to the event for today, which is called Rebuilding Democracy in Post-Nazi Germany, a conversation with Professors Mikkel Dack and Alexandria Ruble, sponsored by the German Embassy and co-hosted by the German program in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and also the Center for Humanities Research. We're thrilled to be able to co-host this event as it dovetails with our center's annual theme for this year, which is democracy, disposability, and repair. I'll begin by introducing my colleague, Professor Samuel Clowes Huneke, who will then introduce our special guests. Samuel Huneke is a historian of modern Germany and assistant professor, though not for long, of history at George Mason University. His research focuses in particular on the history of gender and sexuality, legal history, and the history of democracy and dictatorship. His first book, States of Liberation, Gay Men Between Dictatorship and Democracy in Cold War Germany, which was published in 2022 by the University of Toronto Press, won the David Barclay Book Prize from the German Studies Association, and another book prize as well. These haven't. Okay. We could go on at length about the important impact this book has had already. But the book explores the place of queer men in both East and West Germany between 1945 and 1989. He's also the author of A Queer Theory of the State, published in 2023, as well as numerous scholarly articles and chapters. In addition to his academic work, he writes regularly for public venues, including the New Republic, the LA Review of Books, the Boston Review, and The Point. It's an absolute pleasure to turn the floor over to him.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you for hosting us here at the Center for Humanities Research, which I think has a very special place in the hearts of all of the humanists here at George Mason. I'd also like to thank the German Embassy, the German program in MCL, and the Department for History and Art History for helping to sponsor and make this event possible. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be welcoming these two colleagues here today, and I'll give brief bios of each of them, and then we'll dive into sort of conversation, which will last about 45 minutes to an hour, followed by a sort of open Q&A with everyone. So first, Mikkel Dack is an assistant professor of modern European history at Rowan University and director of research for the Rowan Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights. He earned his PhD from the University of Calgary in 2016, and he's also studied at the Freie Universität Berlin and the Helmut Schmidt Universität of the German Bundeswehr. His research engages with political and cultural history and the study of violence, identity, and social memory. He is particularly interested in the legacies of war in 20th century Germany, including political de-radicalization, which very much fits with today's theme. His recently published book, Everyday Denazification in Post-War Germany, which was published this year with Cambridge University Press, explores Allied efforts to simultaneously punish and reorient former Nazis, as well as the emotional consequences of denazification for ordinary German citizens. He has also written research articles and chapters on post-traumatic stress, wartime sexual violence, eugenics legislation, and neo-fascism in Europe. He is currently involved in a number of projects related to combating the far-right violent extremists in Europe and the United States. His work has been supported by the German Historical Institute, the German Research Foundation, the German Academic Exchange Service, the French National Research Agency, the Botsteber Institute for Austrian American Studies, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. He is also a Humboldt Fellow. Welcome. Alexandria Ruble is an assistant professor of European history at the University of Idaho. She earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2017. Her research focuses on 20th century Central Europe, Germany, Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust, the Cold War, women's and gender history, and legal history. Her first book, Entangled Emancipation, Women's Rights in Cold War Germany, is coming out next month with University of Toronto Press. and it explores how Germans reimagined and recreated new family laws in East and West Germany after 1945. It argues that the Cold War alternately catalyzed and halted reforms in the 1950s and 1960s. Her second book project explores how political prisoners experienced persecution by the Nazis between 1933 and 1945, and how they reintegrated themselves into East and West German societies after 1945. Her work has been supported by the American Association of University Women, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum here in DC, the Fulbright U.S. Student Program, and the German Academic Exchange Service, among others. So welcome to both of you. We're really excited to have you, and we'll dive right in. So the first sort of icebreaker question is, you've each, as I just mentioned, published or are about to publish really wonderful first books this year. So first of all, congratulations on that. And to start off the conversation, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about your books, how you came to the topic, what the main arguments are, and especially how it relates to today's theme of rebuilding democracy in post-Nazi Germany.
Take it away. All right. So thank you for that introduction. And thank you for coming here and to our Zoom participants. Yeah, I'm just delighted to be here today. So thinking back to how I came to this topic, I actually came to this topic as an undergraduate. And I began at this stage working on a project about how the American occupation dealt with German women and attempted to re-educate them about democracy. And conversely, how German women then reacted to this democracy education that they were receiving. And this led me to researching feminism, if you will, women's rights activism in the 40s and 50s, primarily in West Germany was where I initially looked. And one of the biggest issues that they debated at this point in time was the reform of marriage and family law, which dated back to 1900. This is a very patriarchal law. Men got to make all decisions for their wives. Married women could not work full time, et cetera, et cetera. As I was reading through these sources, what I found was that they were constantly making references to parallel legal reforms in East Germany. So it quickly became a comparative project. I know, Sam, you probably understand how that works a fair bit. But the deeper I went, the more it became obvious to me that this was not just about comparison, that at every step along the way, the two Germanys were in a competition over redefining gender roles and women's rights. And in the end, the two Germanys end up passing two laws. West Germany passes the Equal Rights Act in 1957. East Germany passes the Family Code in 1965 that ultimately do expand women's rights in marriage and the family. So there's really two main arguments to the book. The first is that it's the Cold War competition between the two sides that catalyzes change after more than half a century of living with this version of civil law. The second is that there are actors on the ground who are instrumental in changing these laws. So thinking as to how it relates to democracy in post-Nazi Germany, I'll just kind of preface this by saying that most of my remarks probably later in this conversation will refer to West Germany, but we do have, in my case, the East Germany, which kind of complicates this discussion a little bit because, at least the leaders that I deal with in East Germany argued that they were pursuing democratization. They argued that they're setting up people's democracies. We know that in reality, this is a communist dictatorship that did not resemble a Western liberal democracy. But that caveat aside, I think that something that my book shows is that at least in both Germanys, but especially in the West, is how instrumental categories like gender are to re-articulating civil rights. And not both in terms of gender roles, but also just as a group, as a category. Across the four occupation zones of Germany, there was what they called a surplus of 7 million women to men. So the occupiers looked at this demographic imbalance and realized that women were really crucial to this democratization process and that they were the way going forward. So I'll turn it over to Mikkel at that point.
Thank you. And thanks, Sam, and to Allison and everyone for hosting us. It's really great to be here. And thanks to everyone who's in person and also online. So my book, just to go back, 5 or 10 or 15 years, and here it is, the book. just pause and just appreciate it. No, I'm just joking. No.
Yay.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you. So Everyday Denazification, my book, it's a grassroots history of the Allied campaign to forever purge Nazism from post-war Germany. Its focus is the infamous Fragebogen, this political questionnaire that was distributed to as many as 20 million Germans after the war. At the time, it was the largest survey in history ever anywhere, and its intention was to screen individuals about their Nazi past. To identify, categorize, and ultimately punish people by removing them from employment, from influential employment. It was an absolutely massive undertaking. The Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets all used this form or a version of it. But the book explores what denazification looked like on the ground and how it impacted the lives of Germans and their families as they recovered from the war. How I came to this topic is just by pure happenstance. I was in the National Archives, just other side of town in College Park. It's been 15 years ago now. Wow. And I was there for a very different research project. And it was the last day. I think all the historians in this room probably can understand this, but on your last day in the archive, you've pulled every box, you placed every order that you were intended to, and then you have one pull left. And this is what I did. I ordered a cart of boxes. And under, I think the record collection was called miscellaneous occupation. And they arrived, I opened the first box, and there they were in all their glory. These Fragebogen, this often talked about, but no one really knows much about it. Just in one box, there were hundreds of them. And so immediately I went to the archivist and I, asked him, okay, this, am I allowed to look at these? And he said, no, you're not. And he took them away immediately. And so, I kind of kicked myself for asking the question. The point is, I had to fill out a questionnaire to look at the questionnaires, ironically. And the turnaround was quick. And then I kind of just dropped my other project, and I knew that I had to focus on this Fragebogen. And since then, it's been a bit of a global treasure hunt. I've been looking for more of these questionnaires around the world. I think now, this book represents 30 archives in 5 countries. And not just the questionnaire, but other documents related to them, because it's my opinion, this is really a window into the everyday experience of denazification. It's not about war crime trials. It's not about banning the Nazi Party. It's about screening citizens for employment. Like, that's essentially what denazification was on the ground, or the largest part of it. And in the book, I make, like Alex, I make 2 arguments. Well, I make more than that, but the 2 I'm going to talk about now is that the ideological war, as it was called, against fascism amounted to an enormous paper project. It was not, like I said, it was not war crimes, but upwards of 95%. The British occupiers put it at 95% of their resources and funding. Their money went towards screening. And for most Germans, the completion of questionnaires defined their entire denazification experience. Therefore, these surveys held immense authority over their material and emotional lives. But also, I argue that despite its many failures, and I think the Fragebogen, this questionnaire, had many inherent shortcomings. To put it lightly, the program it turned denazification into an individual act of reflection. It brought denazification into the homes of Germans, far away from the courts at Nuremberg, and the concept of personal accountability, making ordinary Germans reflect on their past decisions, to assert their current beliefs, and also, to state their political and moral positions at the time. And I think, these initial years after the war are incredibly important to study when we're looking at democratization, because Germans were traumatized, they were impressionable, and I think, in concert with the Allied occupiers, there was a kind of a certain mental foundation was created upon which democratic ideas and institutions were.
Yeah, great. So I think, one key question about the occupation period is basically how successful was it, right? You have these 4 Allied powers that come in and basically want to build a country from scratch, more or less, right? Germany doesn't have a functioning government. It's not really even a state any longer. And as we've sort of been getting at with these descriptions, the 2 sort of key elements of that occupation period are democratization and denazification. In some ways, they're sort of 2 sides of the same coin. And one of the key debates in my sort of read of the scholarship or interpretations of this period is the question of how successful those processes were. How successful was this aim of rebuilding a democratic Germany? Obviously, we're mostly talking about West Germany here, but East Germany was also in its mind, in the minds of its leaders, sort of building its own version of a democratized and a denazified country. And so I guess I'm curious what your position on that is. And it's obviously a vast question. It's a question that demands a sort of nuanced answer. You can't just say, oh, it was or wasn't successful. But I'm curious what you even make of that question or how you think about starting to answer it.
Well, I mean, I think Mikkel will agree with this too, and I was getting the sense from reading your book that it really depends on what level you're looking at, right? And to give you a couple examples that just come from my own work, but luckily actually overlaps a lot with what happens in everyday denazification is, and I'll go back to what I was initially interested in was that I was trying to understand how, first of all, women's rights and women factored into this process of democratization, primarily in West Germany, but later on, I think about this in the context of East Germany as well. So if we're looking at this in a purely structural and legal sense, then women's rights were established from the get-go. The 1949 Basic Law, which is their provisional constitution, states verbatim in Article 3, men and women have equal rights. If you're thinking about this from a comparative perspective, the United States still does not have an equal rights amendment. Right. So, and this is actually what they draw from in 1949, or actually is an earlier, more limited version that comes from the Weimar Constitution in 1919. So there's already a precedent for this. East Germany, incidentally, has the exact same clause with the same wording. Men and women have equal rights. So if you would end in 1949, you would just assume men and women have equal rights. That's it. It's written into the Constitution. It's done. But the problem with that is that, when you start looking at the laws that governs, is that those laws didn't guarantee women equal rights. The Civil Code, as I mentioned, it's inherited. It goes back to 1900. This law that they inherit, incidentally, both in East and West Germany, it limits women's rights in really crucial ways. And so for these politicians then at this stage, what they have to do, and they're mandated by the Constitution to do, is at some point they have to rewrite these laws to align them with the Constitution. But as you can imagine, that takes time. These are controversial issues. How do you define equal rights? There's kind of this common phrase that pops up a lot in these debates of, in German, it would be gleich, aber ungleich, right? Equal, but not equal, right? Or equal, but different, even one could potentially translate that as. And so what happens is we have a constitution that says men and women have equal rights, but until the late 1950s, at least in West Germany, married women still cannot work without the approval of their husband, and even then it's only part-time. Married women cannot have their own bank account. They cannot pursue a no-fault divorce. Married women cannot keep their own last name, right, when they marry, right? We go down the list, right? But there's a number of things that are very limiting in terms of their social, their civil, and their economic rights. So at this stage, particularly before the laws are passed, married women's rights in particular are very much in limbo. Like I said, they can vote, they can't have their own bank accounts. It really depends on what level you're looking at. But the other side of that too is that if you're looking at it from a structural and legal perspective. If we look at what women's groups are doing on the ground to change this, then our perspective of to what extent they're democratized is quite different. These are women who are actively petitioning the government. They're spurring individuals in their organizations to write letters explaining their own stories. They are writing in the press. They have their own women's press that they're also publishing articles. They have letters to the editors that talk about these issues. If we look at it on that level, right, we're actually seeing democracy in a certain sense flourishing, or democratization flourishing at this stage, even though these women don't necessarily have the full legal rights that they want, right, and feel entitled to. So from that perspective, even when their efforts are not entirely successful in rewriting the laws in the ways that they might want, the fact is they are doing it, right? They are participating in democracy very actively.
And that sort of gets to the question of what do we mean when we talk about democracy? What do we mean when we talk about democratization.
And yeah, and that's it's exactly what's I want to say about denazification. It's never clear what this actually means. Even still today, it's Vladimir Putin is something else, but he talks about denazification. Let's not go there. But it's always been a kind of a vague and kind of cloudy term. It seems straightforward. Let's identify and purge Nazi Party members and sympathizers. But what is Nazism? Or do opportunists count? So on and so forth. So it gets a bit murky. But for decades, I will say that this denazification has been characterized, at least in scholarly circles, as a wholesale failure. It's really quite rare to see scholars across generations and disciplines agree to something like this. But for 70 years, there's been kind of a joint venture to not determine if denazification failed, but why it failed. Like this has been the scholarship. And I find this consensus peculiar because, considering there's an absence of any clearly defined aims against which to judge success and failure, and how does one evaluate the ratification of an ideology from society? And what kind of timeline do we use? The fact that Germany is today a leader in Western democracy, does that count? What ingredients do we focus on? So, and democratization doesn't occur overnight. But unfortunately, a lot of the military government administrators thought that it would, and therefore they left Germany really unsatisfied. They thought that this ideological conversion would be immediate and enduring, but it wasn't. And so my argument with regards to success and failure is denazification, the original objectives, the bullet points that the military governments kind of delivered to the German people, they were not achieved. This is clear. But denazification did have the effect of, as I argued, that driving a wedge between the German people and National Socialism. Ideological conversions were often superficial and sometimes often incomplete. But denazification required that millions of citizens build and rehearse non-Nazi narratives. And to really, essentially, in this questionnaire, they were able to kind of write Nazism out of their lives. And this, what I call the shared rite of passage, contributed to the discrediting of the regime and its ideology, leaving kind of a permanent non-Nazi imprint on post-war society.
So you're in some ways both a little more optimistic, I think, and in some ways almost in the absence or that the post-war period provided an opportunity for people to sort of practice denazification or practice democracy, even if they weren't there yet. It was sort of a process of building it. So I agree. I think most of the historiography has been quite down on the success. And if we look at Germany today, it is more or less a successful democracy. And that is a sort of curiosity that's worth explaining if we see the immediate post-war period as such a grim failure. So that sort of gets to my next question, and this deals a little bit more with methodology. It struck me that many histories of this period, and specifically around questions of democratization or denazification, they're often recounted in terms of traditional political history, in particular focusing on the sort of great men of the occupation period, whether those are the American occupiers, intellectuals who are coming from the US or other countries to help rebuild German government, or sort of elite German politicians themselves. What I find particularly generative about both of your scholarship is that you focus much more on ordinary Germans and sort of, in particular, like Alex, with your sort of focus on women, sort of underlooked populations. And so even though you're both using very different sources, I think there's this sort of commonality that you're both kind of looking under the hood of what's actually going on here. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how, you've already talked a little bit about your experience in the archives, but how you sort of came up methodologically with that approach, and what that kind of a focus allows us to see about this period and about the process of democratization that these more sort of old school great man histories maybe don't.
Yeah, so I think one thing that my work allows us to do, right, like you said, sort of buck the old man history, right, chuck it out the window, but also to see just how integral ordinary Germans were to shaping these policies and laws and having these discussions. This is true in the liberal democratic West, where we have women's associations, trade unions, church groups, individuals, not only voicing their concerns, but driving forward change. Just to give you an example, even before the two Germanys formally separate, right, as the Cold War breaks out, when it's still very much the occupation zone, still very much uncertain about what Germany's future is going to be, whether it's going to be a united front going forward. There are women's groups meeting basically in the rubble of these major cities in 1945, 1946, 1947, meeting to draft a new civil code. I actually found that in the archive, right? Like all these meeting minutes, right, and so forth. And they're arguing with each other about what the future should look like, but they also see this, you had thrown in kind of this idea of optimism, right? They see this as a moment of optimism of everything is destroyed. So if everything is destroyed, then that gives us an opportunity to rebuild this the way that we want to. And so they're hoping, I think, to create a sort of template for future legislation. As they, well, once the Cold War begins, the two Germanys separate, that becomes a little more complicated in some ways, and they're now combating, right, an agenda that's much bigger than just, you know, bringing Germany back together and democratizing it. But nevertheless, right, they're playing their role at that stage. And even when, for example, West Germans finally set up a constitutional convention, they're sending delegates to this to figure out what is our new constitution going to look like. There are women's groups that are petitioning their representatives there and saying, you know, make sure you put an equal rights clause. We had one in the Weimar Constitution. We should have one now. This is what it should look like. This is the work that we've done. It actually, in some ways, enables some of those groups too, because they kind of grab the drafts and are like, oh, perfect, somebody already did the work for us. At a later stage, we'll just start with that, right? And so, and what's interesting too is that this is also the case in East Germany, which again, I should stress is by no means a democracy. And again, that makes it a little bit of an odd man out in this conversation. But what I do want to say is that the dictatorship was sometimes more susceptible to public pressure than we might assume. And in one of the chapters of my book, what I'm able to demonstrate is that there's a point in 1954 when East Germans, mostly Christians, mostly church members, managed to halt a series of reforms from going forward by actively petitioning the regime, and the regime shut it down. And the interesting thing is they do this in part because they co-opt some of the regime's language about reunification and the Cold War, and they throw it back at the East German government. But a second point I wanted to mention too is just that I think some of my work challenges our assumptions about the way these states functioned. And when I read your book, right, this is something that really resonated with me. Like just because the Federal Republic was a liberal democracy did not mean that its leaders, like Adenauer, were always supportive of pushing forward, right, equal rights for every single citizen. That wasn't always high on their agenda. And in some cases, right, he resorted to some what we might consider undemocratic methods to shut down his opposition. And then just because the GDR, right, or East Germany, was a dictatorship, again, did not mean that its leaders always cracked down on opposition, right? In the particular cases I look at, they actually bend to that will. And to kind of draw in a quote from one of my mentors in graduate school, he said, well, there are times when dictatorships want to be liked too, right? And they have to sort of walk that line because, right, they can't be authoritarian one at a time, right? There's a little bit of give in order for them to achieve this larger agenda. And those are not necessarily points that old school scholarship makes, but it actually makes us think a little bit more about, right, the trajectories of each state.
Yeah, from my research, the subject of denazification in general, it's for the longest time been a history about occupation policy and its statistical outcomes. It's talking about top down, great man history, like this is it, which is actually a bit shocking because there's such a rich history of the Nachkriegszeit, the immediate post-war, that both of you are familiar with. It's just whether it's soldier-civilian encounters or memory or culture or gender, it's a really quite a rich body of scholarship. But that is not extended to denazification. It's still very statistic-driven, top down, and either it's from the occupier or the occupied. It's very rare. There's both perspectives are accounted for. But what I want my book to do, I hope it does this, is provide kind of a more comprehensive and inclusive history of denazification to humanize the story. The ideological war against Nazism was not experienced by Germany. It was experienced by Germans. And I think that is, it's a simple, kind of realization, but it's an important one. Was denazification successful? Which researchers have been obsessed with answering this question, generating a definitive verdict about, was it successful? And like Sam said, he kind of alluded to, it's more complex than that, right? Absolutely. But instead of looking at how many party members lost their jobs, why don't we look at, the lives of the people who went through denazification? Where they ended up, what their beliefs were, their opinions. But I also want to mention that my research, much like Alex transcends traditional methodological boundaries, because the Nachkriegszeit is, like I said, always, either from the military, American military, or their occupation military governments, or from the German perspective. And it's a very kind of grassroots cultural experience, and both are important, but they're so often not examined in the same body, in the same studies. So I look at both ordinary Germans and also ordinary soldiers who were on the ground administering denazification. I don't think we can't forget that story either, because they impacted everyday Germans, and everyday Germans impacted everyday soldiers. And policy shifted, it changed on the ground because of this relationship. So I believe that the kind of the story of denazification and the story of democratization is incomplete without these different stories, different vantage points.
I wanted to chime in because one thing that made me super happy reading your book is that you do bring in the voices of women. And I actually remember going to the National Archive when I was an undergrad. I was working on this project, and I walk in, right, and I'm looking at the Angus files, and I explain my project, and this archivist looks at me and he's like, "There's nothing about women in those files." And I've read the literature, right? I'm like, I know there's something about women in these files. Like I've got a list of files here, and he's just kind of like, "Yeah, I can't do anything for you." But that was a long time ago. But you found their voices.
Yeah, and definitely found the absence of voices too, which is telling too.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, maybe we can segue into a question about gender. And
I mean, that would actually be a perfect, well, as sort of the way that we think about and tell history now is oftentimes inflected through lenses of race, class, gender, sexuality, sort of various identitarian lenses. And again, that's part and parcel of that project of sort of moving beyond top-down great man history. But I am curious how those lenses are important to your work, and how not every history sort of has to be about everything. But I think that we are all now trained to sort of have all these questions in the back of our minds. Even though sexuality is the most important one for my own work, I definitely sort of have in the back of my mind, okay, how is gender, obviously, how is class, how is race figuring into these questions? So I guess I'm curious to hear just a little bit more about that approach and how it fits into or informs your work. And also where, if we want to go really broad with it, where does history sort of go from that methodological point?
You want to kick it off?
Yeah, there's a lot there to just let's see. Well, the first, maybe most basic thing to acknowledge in a project like mine is when we say gender, we don't actually just mean women, right? We are talking about a power relationship between men and women historically, right? And even that has broadened, right, in recent terms, but at least in terms of the people that I am looking at, right? When they refer to that, they're primarily talking about a marital relationship between, right, a heterosexual couple. So, right, we have to kind of establish some of those boundaries and understanding that sometimes even in their own sources, when they're talking about women, they actually are talking about that gendered relationship. And sometimes they're talking about very specific women, right? When they say women, they might mean married women. Right. So there's some of those distinctions there that I think we have to think about what those identities meant at that point in time. Another thing that I think is really critical, of course, is always the issue of intersectionality. The way that comes up in my work, because I am dealing with white German women, is primarily through either class or religious identities. And for a lot of the both Protestant and Catholic women that I deal with in my book, For them, it's their confessional identity that precedes everything, right? It determines their politics. It is not necessarily their identity as women. And so one might assume walking into the project, they're in this discussion about women's rights. It is because they care about their roles as women, and that's not untrue. But also there are other things that are playing into their thinking, right? And sometimes that, like for example, in a parliamentary debate for a woman who's coming from the Christian Democratic Union, for sometimes that's really is her primary identity, right? Being a Christian Democrat. She is representing the party line. But there are also women in that party who put that aside and prioritize women's rights, right, above party line. So it kind of depends. And then, we also see that a bit with class too, depending on if they're coming from the SPD, which would have been like the sort of center-left working class party at this time. So there's a bit of that. But I guess that's all to say that we can't assume that one group would be monolithic, but rather we have to look at each individual group and kind of figure out, right, where their priorities are and why they're making those particular arguments at that point in time. And that even among groups, there can be a lot of infighting too, and lots of different debates. There's different Catholic women's groups, for instance, that have different takes on how the law should go. They're arguing with the bishops, right, and some of those Catholic leaders. And so even within that broad spectrum, right, we can have a lot of different things.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about. But class and gender are immensely important to the denazification experience. But like Alex said, trying to communicate that and to get at it in the archive is really difficult because, yes, there are like registered women's organizations during the occupation under UNGAS and other authoritative institutions, but beyond that, like voices are either not heard or they're muffled in some way or another. But and so many times when I was workshopping chapters of this book, I'd be in a room much like this, and people would ask me like, "Where are the women? Where are the women?" Right? And I heard that enough that I'm like, hey, what is going on here? Like what am I missing here? But this, like, but denazification, was by and large about screening former party members for influential positions, right? And majority of Nazi party members were men, and the majority of influential positions that were screened were occupied by middle class educated men. So right there, like gender and class matter a lot. That's not to say that the demographics are consistent. It's estimated, a recent study on denazification estimates that around 30% of denazification cases were of women. But still, by and large, we're talking mostly about middle class educated men. With regards to class, this is in the British zone, for example. If you wanted to enroll in a university, you had to fill out a questionnaire. It'd be denazified, it's called. But if you wanted to attend a community college, one of the Volkshochschule, you did not, right? If you want, there was also the 1946 Christmas amnesty. So if you were in the lowest salary bracket, you were all immediately amnestied from any Nazi past. So class is kind of always present, socioeconomic status, and like I said, yeah, gender. A lot of women remained under the radar of denazification. That's not to say they weren't affected by it. A lot of the gender dynamics at home changed very quickly. Often, if the husband was denied employment. Elizabeth Heinemann talks a lot about this, about how they came home and they were unwilling to do any other work. So this overtaxed the women who had to either take up employment outside the home if they weren't already working, or to manage the household as well. And women and men were, when they both had Nazi past, they were punished differently, interpreted differently for the so there's kind of a lot there. And then, for men, this what Frank Bies calls a crisis of masculinity, right? They come home from the war, they may have a physical disability, they've been defeated, right? And they come home to a country where they're under military occupation. They're emasculated in one way or another, and they're denied, participation in this post-war economy and democracy. This has incredible, kind of consequences for male identity. And but one question I have for you, Alex, and this is reading your work, it keeps coming up, and I'm curious, and that is that in the early years of the occupation, 1945, 1946, military occupiers, they really didn't see women, right? It was assumed that women were apolitical, that they were not involved in politics, and therefore they were not denazified, they're not targeted as such. And when during in conversations of democracy, they were also kind of left out. But that seems to have shifted quite abruptly in like late 46, early 47, when these organizations started to be formed, at least like formally, right? You said like amidst the rubble, there were kind of organizations, but can you pinpoint, is there like a specific moment or a change in opinion that where women actually were seen as important to rebuilding democracy?
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at this is that, well, the important moment, I think, is the outbreak, for being honest, because we also have to consider too that the Western zones tended to be a bit more decentralized than the Soviet zone. So what that means for women, for example, is in the Soviet zone, they're already putting in places like an equal wages for equal work policy. Now, that's not always uniformly applied, so we shouldn't look at that with rosy glasses here. But nevertheless, there's already been, right, a very centralized order from the Soviets to try to entice women who, you know, proportionally there are more women in the Soviet zone given its location in the East. There's a certain incentive there to entice them to support the Soviets. And that's not to say there wasn't that sentiment a bit in the West, but it's a lot more decentralized. We're dealing with 3 different occupiers there who are sort of, right, in different ways, having these different conversations with different women's groups. And so there's, you know, if we look at it from that perspective, just logistically, there's some reasons that kind of lead into that as well. But I think what happens then is these women's groups are meeting, they are discussing some of these issues, what they hope their future will look like. And the American occupation, the British too, and then, but mostly Americans are spearheading this. The Americans realize that that if they can get women on their side, they can centralize them, they can use them as a bulwark against communism, right? And I think that's what really stirs them to suddenly create a women's affairs branch. Now, the French don't actually create any kind of centralized women's affairs branch, but the Americans and the British do. And this is when we start to see the funding of these re-education campaigns, democracy campaigns. You know, wives of prominent occupation officials are leading these seminars, right, in rooms like this, right, teaching women about what democracy and what the Constitution and why they should vote. And so, you know, my sense is that to some extent, right, there's that fear of denazification. They also kind of roll that into really building women up as a wall against communism. Yeah.
That makes sense. And I also wonder, like, in late 1946, there was, some of you are probably familiar with the famous Stuttgart speech, where occupation policy for all 4 occupying governments it changed course. So it was, instead of being about punitive actions, it was more rehabilitative and restorative. And this was like, this was a big deal. It was kind of a break from like, we are going to build Cold War, you know, allies instead of punishing people. And I wonder if that like that must, like, you know, be part of what you're saying, right? This over.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, there's also, I think, a very common assumption among the occupiers that, well, I should say there's a gendered assumption, right? That men are these violent perpetrators, right? That men are responsible, but women were ignorant, right? They followed the Nazis because they didn't know about crime, right? Not necessarily because they had these like vile tendencies, but rather that they just didn't know better. And if they were only educated the right way, right, then, you know, we could avoid them supporting the Nazis. I don't know if you come across some of that.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh yeah, there are many documented cases, correspondence within military government offices saying, like, you know, depicting women as being, you know, politically passive or kind of voting with their husbands and such, right? And therefore they're just not a threat to democracy. You know?
And did you come up with cases of women intentionally sort of using that narrative to get off the hook of sort of denazification?
Yeah, what I did is something like similar to that. I'm currently writing an article about denunciation, like voluntary informing, and there are just thousands of denunciation letters, statements sent to military government saying, "Hey, like, my neighbor is using too much firewood, and by the way, her husband was SS." You know, so just like taking the opportunity, to air grievances about, and so I'm doing a kind of a statistical analysis right now, and something like women denounced, at least in this sample study that I have, about 4 or 5 times more than men did. And the nature of denunciation is quite different too. But I did see that, and I think from a position of kind of like, I'm not under the microscope with denazification. I think maybe they felt a little more, more of an ability to voice grievances, even if it's like community levels.
And in some ways, I mean, I've looked at some similar denunciations, not necessarily to the military authorities, but to local prosecutors. And I definitely have noticed the sort of gender sort of disparities that you're mentioning. And it strikes me that in some ways that's a continuity with the Nazi period, right? Because of course all these people were denouncing people during the Nazi period, and they're continuing the same practice into the post-war period, but with just a different inflection. Right now, it's a sort of democratic or anti-Nazi denunciation.
Yeah, and then this is what I argue in this article is that under the Gestapo regime, denunciation kind of came from below, right? These Gestapo offices were often clearinghouses, really, for voluntary, unexpected denunciations, and the Stasi was very different. It was more from above, and I think this occupation period, this overlooked period, it was no accusatory pause. It was really a bridge these two regimes, these denunciatory regimes. And I think, this is an important. There was no, these kind of activities were very familiar, right, to people, and they rushed to it. Yeah.
Very much. I was going to also say the idea of women as a bulwark against communism sort of seems to my mind to pick up on a long history of sort of male assumptions about the way that women will vote and behave politically, going back to when women were first enfranchised in various countries, and concerns that they'll be too religious or they won't be progressive enough, or this, that, or the other thing. There's always these sort of assumptions about how women will vote as a bloc. And then, of course, empirically, women vote in just as varied a way as men do. And, but it's interesting that they continue to sort of have these assumptions, even though Germany has had female suffrage for decades at this point. I mean, longer than pretty much any other industrialized country. Okay, so I think I have one sort of final question before we turn it over to everyone for a Q&A. And that's to take us up to the present. So one reason that I was really excited to bring you here is I think that these questions about rehabilitating a country after a sort of, right-wing regime, about building and maintaining democracy, are still very much alive. They're with us, not just in the US, but I think across the world. And so, to put it briefly, I'm curious if you see there being any lessons in the work that you've done for how we think about, in particular, democratization or democracy today, building it, sustaining it. And, I think it's worth mentioning that this period, the occupation period, has been used in the recent past or people have drawn perhaps the wrong lessons from it, right? I think German historians are all familiar with the fact that the Bush administration looked to the occupation period when they designed the invasion and occupation of Iraq and drew perhaps incorrect lessons, or didn't listen to people who perhaps had a better insight into how the occupation had actually functioned, and what had made its successes successful. So anyway, I'm curious if you sort of see any lessons from this period, or any optimism that you can draw out of it for our own period today.
Good question. Yeah.
Want to start on that?
Sure. Yeah, I can start this one. Yeah, thanks, Sam. This is of course, we historians, we're very careful not to forecast the future, right? That's not our expertise, but like you said, we can draw lessons, and my research does offer a few, and my current larger book project, which I've been working at for a couple of years already now, is about de-radicalization, and it's more of it's still a historical kind of analysis, but it's comparative, and it brings us into the future. So these are things that have been on my mind a lot recently, and I don't want to be too prescriptive, but let me just say a few things that I think are important, at least specifically what denazification and the Fragebogen project taught us. And that is, first of all, kind of, there has to be an appropriate balance between punitive and restorative programs. And if anything, the language and the, kind of the legislative theme has to be constructive. It can't be about fighting fascism. It can't be about fighting the radical right. It has to be about defending and preserving democracy. I think that's how it has to be kind of interpreted. This is, there's certainly like a need for offensive measures and punitive actions, but in order to really kind of come up with a nonpartisan, kind of strategy, you have to focus on what citizens have in common, not what separates them. I know this is idealistic, but I'm a historian, so I can get away with this. But also, you cannot rely entirely on group membership when evaluating someone as a threat to democracy. It doesn't get you that far. I think denazification got that wrong, and so did debathification in Iraq. But more importantly, I could talk about monitoring the media and education and all this, but I think most important what the questionnaire and what denazification has told us is you have to enroll the individual. You have to involve them in their de-radicalization, their reorientation. Many far-right anti-democratic players feel disenfranchised, they feel unheard, they feel unrepresented, and therefore kind of rehabilitative activities need to account for including them. And every psychological model on de-radicalization highlights this. It's incredibly important. I could go on, but I won't, please.
Yeah, no, I've got really, I think, 3 different points that come to mind. The first thing is that I think what we can learn, particularly from the very early period, is that democracy and democratization are ongoing projects. What we see happening with at least some of the politicians that I research that who are going through these constitutional conventions is that they've learned lessons from Weimar that they're putting into practice, that they've learned after 12 years of living under the Nazis. It doesn't mean that what they have created is perfect. It's contextual, right? They're creating this in a context of 1948, 1949 as the Cold War is broken out. They're in this immediate post-war period. But right, it doesn't mean that that project ends in 1949 just because the basic law is created. The Constitution has amendments, right? Because contexts change, right? History changes. And so, there's that aspect of that, democracy as an institution, right, is something that has to be constantly improved, right? Constantly thought about in these contexts. Now, you had mentioned interest groups, right? The other side of that, I think, is understanding what those interest groups are in a democracy, right? And understanding, and this is, again, something that relates, I think, very much to your work, Sam, on and gay men, right? And citizenship is understanding what their buy-in is, understanding what their lack of rights are. And again, those groups, those interest groups might change over time. The groups that I look at in the 1940s and the 1950s are not the same composition that they would be today, and that's okay, right? It changes. And so to think about it on that level too. A third thing that comes to mind too is that going back to this idea that democracy as an institution is not some monolithic, unchanging thing that just stays in place forever, is that groups that are opposed to liberal democracy and that are opposed to democratization will use democratic institutions to undo democracy, right? We cannot assume that safeguards in place are always going to protect us. Now, of course, in 1949, what do West Germans do? They put in a 5% rule in hopes of keeping out some extremist parties, and for many decades, that succeeded, right, to some extent. That is one safeguard that can be put in place. They certainly learned from the way the Weimar Constitution was written that people like Hitler will exploit certain clauses, right, to come to power. So they made sure not to do that again. But we always have to, I think, be vigilant of the ways that non or undemocratic groups might be trying to take advantage, right, of those loopholes in order to undo democracy for, very, very violent ends.
Wow, well, on that sort of grim note, thank you both for